Okay, so today we're diving into Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki.
Right.
This book has really stirred up a lot of talk about personal finance.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think it's really because it challenges a lot of conventional thinking about how we approach money.
Hmm.
And I'm excited to really unpack some of those core ideas and see what insights we can glean from it together.
Sounds good.
So the book basically revolves around the contrasting financial philosophies of two figures in Kiyosaki's life. His biological father, whom he calls his poor dad, and his best friend, Mike's father, the rich dad.
Right.
And it's really through comparing and contrasting these two figures that Kiyosaki kind of illuminates these different mindsets about money and how they lead to really different outcomes.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the tale of two fathers, the kind of central narrative of the book.
Okay.
So we have the poor dad, who's a highly educated teacher,
Yeah.
and the rich dad, who's a successful businessman, but who didn't necessarily have that same level of formal education.
Right off the bat, you see these two very different paths.
Exactly, and different values and priorities, right?
Absolutely.
So the poor dad was really big on, getting a good education,
Hmm.
securing a stable job with benefits, working hard, being honest.
Classic values that a lot of us are raised with, right?
Right. It's kind of the conventional wisdom that a lot of us are brought up with. And
Yeah.
then you have the rich dad who had a completely different perspective.
Yeah, his view was really centered on this idea that the rich don't work for money, money works for them.
Right. And that's a really big shift in thinking.
It is.
It's moving away from that idea of trading your time for money and towards this concept of building assets that generate income.
Exactly. Creating a system that works for you, even when you're not actively working.
So Kiyosaki essentially had these two influential figures in his life presenting him with these opposing views on money. And he kind of had to choose which path to follow.
It was his real-world financial education.
Yeah, and it really highlights how our beliefs about money are often shaped by our environment and the people we're surrounded by.
Right. And those beliefs ultimately influence our actions and our financial outcomes.
So one of the big takeaways from the book is this idea of making money work for you.
Right.
And there's this story that I think really drives this home where a young Kiyosaki and his friend Mike are working for the rich dad. And I think they're 9 years old at this point.
Yeah, barely even teenagers.
Right. And they're doing these menial jobs for very little pay.
Yeah, like pennies an hour, practically.
And Kiyosaki is understandably frustrated, right? He's putting in all this work and he's barely getting anything in return.
He felt like he was being taken advantage of.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us would probably feel the same way in that situation.
It's a natural reaction.
But the rich dad had a very specific reason for doing this.
It was a lesson disguised as a job.
Right. He wanted to teach Kiyosaki and Mike a crucial lesson about money that most people never learn.
He wanted to show them that most people spend their whole lives working for money without ever understanding how to make money work for them.
And that's a really fundamental difference, isn't it?
It's a huge distinction.
Between the poor and middle class who mostly earn income through their labor,
Right.
and the rich who focus on building assets that generate income independently of their direct involvement.
Yeah, it's about creating passive income, building wealth, even when you're not actively working at a job.
And that brings us to the book's definition of assets and liabilities, which is really where Rich Dad, Poor Dad starts to challenge conventional thinking. So can you explain how the rich dad defines those terms?
Well, he keeps it pretty straightforward. An asset puts money in your pocket, and a liability takes money out.
Simple but powerful, right?
Extremely powerful.
Because it forces you to look at things in a different light.
It challenges our assumptions about what actually constitutes wealth.
Take, for example, owning a home.
Yeah.
That's traditionally seen as a major asset.
Right, it's the American dream, right?
But the rich dad would argue that if you're buying a house with a mortgage and you're constantly making payments on that mortgage, plus property taxes, insurance, maintenance,
If it's consistently draining your money,
then it's actually functioning as a liability.
yeah, even though it might appreciate in value over time, it's not putting money in your pocket in the present.
Which can be a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people.
It goes against everything we're often told about homeownership.
Exactly, because culturally owning a home is seen as this marker of success and stability. But the rich dad's perspective really forces you to look at the actual cash flow.
Where's the money going? Is it coming in or going out?
And he contrasts this with things like rental properties that generate positive cash flow,
Yeah.
stock market investments that pay dividends, or a business that can operate without your constant direct involvement.
These are the true assets. in his view.
Because they're actively putting money in your pocket.
Right, they're working for you, generating income even when you're not actively working.
So the key takeaway here is that if you want to build wealth, you need to shift your focus from relying solely on your job income to acquiring assets that generate income for you.
It's about building a portfolio of income-producing assets that work for you passively.
And that brings us to the importance of financial education, which is another big theme in the book.
Right.
And there's this interesting contrast between the poor dad's emphasis on formal education and the rich dad's emphasis on financial literacy.
Yeah, two very different kinds of knowledge.
So the poor dad really believed in the power of going to school.
Getting good grades, getting a degree.
Right, and then finding a secure, well-paying job.
That was his path to financial security.
The rich dad, on the other hand, argued that while school might teach you how to work for money,
It doesn't really teach you how to have money work for you.
right, and he really pushed Kiyosaki to learn about investing,
Yeah.
business, the tax system, things that aren't typically taught in traditional schools.
He saw financial literacy as a separate and crucial skill set.
And it's interesting because, the book points out that there are a lot of highly educated people who struggle financially. And conversely, there are people without formal education who are quite wealthy.
Because they understand how money works,
Right. They've developed that financial intelligence.
which isn't necessarily tied to academic achievement.
Another big idea that the book delves into is overcoming fear.
Yeah, fear plays a huge role in our financial decisions.
And the rich dad had a very different relationship with fear than the poor dad.
Right.
So the rich dad believed that fear was a major obstacle for a lot of people when it comes to building wealth.
The fear of losing money, the fear of failure.
Right, and those fears can really hold people back from taking risks and pursuing opportunities.
Yeah, it keeps them stuck in their comfort zone, even if that comfort zone isn't financially rewarding.
And we see this with the poor dad who's constantly worried about money.
About debt, about job security,
That anxiety kind of led him to be very risk averse.
which ultimately limited his financial potential.
But the rich dad had this different perspective where he saw failure as a learning opportunity.
Yeah, he famously said that all rich people have lost money at some point,
But the difference is they learned from those losses and they kept going.
while the poor tend to give up after a setback, which reinforces their fear of risk.
And this leads into the book's discussion of the entrepreneurial path, which the rich dad strongly advocated for.
Right. He believed that working for someone else was ultimately helping them achieve their dreams, not yours.
And he introduced this framework of the 4 quadrants,
Okay.
which I think is really helpful for understanding the different ways people generate income.
Yeah, it's a good visual representation.
So can you break down those 4 quadrants for us?
So we have the employee E, the self-employed S, the business owner B, and the investor.
Right.
And the employee and the self-employed, they're both primarily trading their time for money.
Right. The employee works for a salary.
Mm-hmm.
The self-employed person might be a freelancer or have their own small business.
Yeah, but they're still the primary worker. Their income is directly tied to their effort.
But on the right side of the quadrant with the business owner and the investor,
We see a different approach.
so the business owner has created a system that can operate without their constant involvement.
Yeah, think of a franchise or a well-managed company with a strong team,
And the investor generates income through their investments.
allowing their money to work for them.
So the rich dad's message was that true financial freedom comes from moving from the left side of the quadrant to the right side.
From being an employee or self-employed to becoming a business owner or an investor.
Because that's where you start to build real wealth and achieve financial independence.
Right, your income isn't solely dependent on your direct labor anymore.
And the book really stresses that it's not just about understanding these concepts, but about taking action and changing your mindset.
Yeah, knowledge is only powerful if you apply it.
So it's not just about how much money you earn, but about how much you save and how you invest those savings.
Right, it's about building a portfolio of income-generating assets.
And we see this contrast between the poor dad who focused on saving whatever was left over after expenses and the rich dad who was proactively seeking out investment opportunities.
And the book shares examples of how Kiyosaki himself applied these principles.
Right, he invested in real estate, he started businesses.
And he learned from his mistakes along the way.
He didn't always get it right, but he kept learning and adapting.
And that's a key part of the journey.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into Rich Dad, Poor Dad,
Yeah.
I think the core message is that building wealth is less about your circumstances and more about your mindset.
It's about developing financial intelligence and taking control of your finances.
And it's about understanding the difference between working for money and having money work for you.
Right. It's a fundamental shift in perspective.
And I think the book really leaves us with this question. Are you going to follow the traditional path of lifelong employment? Or are you going to consider the more challenging but potentially more rewarding path of building assets and achieving financial freedom?
It's a choice